Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's recording regarding human resources. This is a video recording of the tutorial presented by Jenna Garber from 2020. The material is essentially the same, so we thought we'll just reuse the video for this time. Please go through the video, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll get those questions answered. Thank you. Well, welcome everyone to our session today on human resources, the next topic in our 12-week webinar series for your tutorial. We have today Jenna Garber, who will let her introduce herself and her background and her depth of experience in human resources. Just as an introduction, all of you are obviously aware, healthcare is all about the human resources. You know, the staff that we have in our hospitals and in our organization, that's our real asset. So human resources, while as a topic may be a separate topic, but it touches everything else. And there have been some questions we have covered during the previous weeks which touched on human resources kind of questions as well. And today we'll of course have a lot of new material. So encourage you to ask questions. As we tried last time, you can raise your hand and ask question that way, or you can type it into the chat window, or of course you can unmute yourself and ask the question. So I think we have done this enough times now that you are familiar with all the administrative stuff. So with that, I'll turn this over to Jenna and welcome her. Thanks, Jenna. Please take it off.
Thanks, Raul. My name is Jenna Garber. I am the Vice President of Human Resources for Kennestone and Windy Hill Hospitals within the WellStar Health System. I have been in my current role for about a year, but I've been with WellStar for about 3, all of which have been in a Vice President of HR role. Prior to that at Emory Healthcare for about 9 years in very similar roles, and really have been in human resources for about 15 years. Prior to that, basically human resources roles in smaller organizations that did not have a HR department per se. So it is my pleasure to be able to discuss with you human resources management with respect to the Board of Governors exam that you guys are all going to be taking in the coming weeks and months. It's a great program to be able to kind of get your feet wet with some of the information. I do think there are a lot of other options for training and tutorials that I would encourage you to continue to do as well, just so that you're very acclimated to the types of questions and the types of content that are going to be on the Board of Governors exam. One thing that is for sure is you never really know what the questions will look like, but if you understand the theory and concept, you'll have a much better leg up on being able to ascertain what they're looking for out of that question. So with that, I am going to go ahead. By the way, I've had my FACHE for about a year and a half. I've been a big proponent of the process of getting your fellowship through ACHE, and so wish you all very much good luck as you go through this process. Okay, for some reason it's not moving. Technical difficulties, hold one moment.
Jenna, you should be able to just click any key to advance your slide.
Yeah, it's not doing it.
You may have to.
Oh, there we go. Okay, let's go back to you. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so HR focus areas that you may be familiar with, some of these may be new to you, are really around performance management systems. Those are used for the evaluation process, rewards and recognition, disciplinary policy and procedures. So those systems are part of the HR focus, as well as recruitment and selection techniques. Those sometimes you can have a system that is specific to recruitment, whether that's Taleo, ISOMs, things along those lines, but an area of HR would be recruitment and selection. Many organizations have labor relations strategies and tactics. It depends if you have unions involved in your organization. Sometimes, even if you don't have unions involved, you do have labor relations strategies as a part of your remaining union-free process, but that is something that HR falls up under the HR title at times. Staffing methodology and productivity management. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a little bit, as far as how are your budgets around staffing. Do you have flexible versus fixed? Are you acuity based? Those kinds of things, and we'll talk about that in more detail soon. Employee satisfaction measurement and improvement. That's a very key part of an HR focus, because employee satisfaction is going to make or break many areas of keeping your staff engaged and retained. Motivational techniques, compensation and benefits, worker safety, security, employee health, OSHA, workplace violence. Sometimes those are divvied into other areas outside of HR, but HR usually has their hand in many of those areas to some degree in each organization. And then obviously conflict resolution and grievance. So, and I'm not talking grievance that you would see from a patient experience perspective, because that's a different process, but grievance that employees may feel based on, usually it's performance management issues and processes that they grieve and they want to talk to other people. So HR is usually a part of those processes. All right, here I go again. Hang tight, sorry. Oh, there we go. Okay, so what is an HR executive's role within the organization? Usually there are different types of staff that are throughout the organization, and really trying to make sure that you have the qualified staff that you need, the numbers that you need to meet the strategies of the organization. The healthcare executive is ensuring that the HR functions are effective. So there's a lot of process improvement at times, a lot of ways that the HR executive needs to morph to what's going on. COVID's a great example of that. There are a lot of processes and new tactics that have been added into the HR role based on COVID and based on what the needs of the organization are in the pandemic. So it's just an example. HR philosophy that's expressed in the policies and procedures. So you have to have your HR philosophy, but that needs to, you need to ensure that the policies and procedures are in line with that it is meeting what that strategy is, and that the philosophy is clear, that everyone understands what that looks like, and that your policies and procedures speak to that. Obviously, strategic HR management, what I like to tell people is that a strategy in an organization has a people aspect to it and involves human capital. And the executive HR role is to take that strategy and ensure that the organization has what they need from the people human capital side to manifest completion and execution of that strategy. A process for staff privileges, and then conflict management. And we'll talk a lot more about conflict management as we continue. Also, manager evaluation. Usually the HR executive role is really looking at how to ensure that you have the right talent. How do you ensure that you have a good succession plan for ensuring that if you have leaders leave, that you have a plan in place to ensure that those positions are going to have the manpower that you need to keep moving along with your strategy. You definitely have the development of high performance work teams. It's very important that you're able to execute in a way that is going to give you really the ROI on all of the things that you're working on as a team. And so you want to develop those work teams in a really strong way. Obviously, establishing and evaluating productivity. It's a big part that HR works a lot with operations and finance around that to ensure that productivity is met at the percentage that you want it to be met. For us, that's 100%. And then you also want to be sure that there's legal compliance. So a lot of the initiatives, a lot of the work that is done, or a lot of the needs that come up operationally, you want to be sure that there is compliance to all the legal regulations that surround that. So there are also some functional responsibilities that HR has, and these would not necessarily be led by the executive, other than from a leadership perspective, but these would be more of the things that maybe the middle management band of HR would be working towards. So these are more the tactical things. So workforce planning, which is both strategic and tactical, really making sure that you have your pipeline in the future. Healthcare is a big area where that's important because there's a shortage in a lot of different areas of clinical employees, and making sure that you have your pipeline and that you have really your forecast out there to make sure that you are planning for what the workforce needs are going to look like. Obviously, one of the biggest things that we've been looking at really in many industries is really the generational changing that is happening as the baby boomers are retiring, and what does that look like for the positions that we're going to need to backfill, especially when it works alongside nursing and respiratory and pharmacy and some of these really difficult positions to fill. Management practices, ensuring that your managers are in line with policy and practice. One of the things that you see a lot of times in organizations is managers are handling things a certain way, but that way may or may not be according to policy and practice. And when somebody sues an organization, the organization is going to look at how each one of those operating units, how they handle it as a whole. So if somebody in one of our facilities, one of our hospitals, handles something from a management or performance issue perspective, we are still responsible for that in my location, even if that's not where it happened, because they look at WellStar as a whole. So management practice being consistent and being in line with policy. Selection and placement, ensuring that we have a great, fair process around selection, and also ensuring that we place people in positions where they'll be successful, that they meet the criteria for, and that we have a good onboarding program as well. Training and development, this is something that is going to continue to be important because employees want to feel like they have an opportunity to develop themselves in organizations. And so training and development, helping employees to be everything the organization needs and expects, is very, very important to the organization. And so training and development is also a function of HR. Some organizations don't have it under HR, but that is where it's traditionally housed. Comp and benefits is almost always under HR. And that is usually you have one comp system or one comp process and one benefits process for the organization as a whole. However, in some cases, you might have a different benefits policy or program based on different units of the organization. I can give you an example. When acquisitions take place, the acquiring company has their process for comp and benefits, but the newly acquired company may not automatically be on that comp plan or benefit plan. So, so sometimes you have more than one plan, but a lot of organizations have one that covers the entire operating organization. Employee and labor relations, like we talked about before, labor relations is really referring to the relationship with unions. It talks about collective bargaining agreements. It is, many people have unions, and unions have a place for sure. However, one thing I will say about unions is that when you have a union, the union is the person that the organization deals with, not the employee. And so what we try to tell people, no, this is not something that you go out to your employees and you tell them, because you want to be very careful about that, but it puts a middleman between the employee and the organization. And so employees don't always understand that they are no longer going to have that back to forth relationship with the organization, that there'll be somebody else having that for them. Employee relations is really speaking to how does the employees understand the policies? How do they work within the policies? What does performance management look like? Sometimes employees have concerns about their work environment, that there's an ineffective work environment, ineffective leadership. So employee relations is really dealing with all of that. It's also dealing with a lot of the legislation, HR legislation out there, and how to work within those confines. I grew up in employee relations. That's my background initially in HR. So I have a great love for employee relations. I see it as a very important part of the way that the employee works within the organization. But that is also an area of HR. And then we have the health, safety, and security. Those look different in almost every organization I've ever worked in. You do have your workplace safety, which is OSHA, which is workers' comp, things like that. You also have like employee health in our organization, where we're looking at making sure that we have annual health exams, TB tests, flu vaccines. Obviously right now with COVID, there's all kinds of things. And then security really is making sure, and this can be both organizational security, meaning you have security guards that are manning the place to make sure that the workplace is safe. But it could also be, you know, locks on the doors, and in an HR type environment, a lot of times you have doors that are, you have to buzz people in, because, you know, a lot of people come to HR when they're not happy, you know, so for the safety of the HR staff, sometimes you have a very secure environment over there as well for that reason. All right, so job analysis. Job analysis really isn't, you know, I'm not meaning to read, but it's very self-explanatory in these slides. A systematic study of jobs to determine which activities and responsibilities they include and the relationship with other jobs, qualifications, and conditions. This job analysis is really used when you're designing jobs, you're figuring out what your organization is going to look like from top to bottom, and it's very important as you recruit and select and place those employees, because you want to be sure that they have all of the necessary requirements to be able to be successful in that job. It's also important for your performance appraisals and career development, because you want to be sure that people are being evaluated based on things that the job requires, not just you liking the person or not liking the person. It needs to be based on things that are very, black and white, things that you can really give them ratings on that isn't subjective. And also the job analysis helps when you're figuring out what the compensation is going to look like, what pay grade, and then as far as the compliance of people ensuring, like when you have the Joint Commission come out and they do a regulatory visit, the job analysis is what's helping you design that job description, which is what you're held accountable to from a regulatory perspective. And the job analysis really is a cornerstone of HR. I mean, that is a big piece of ensuring that the people that work in the organization are the ones that are qualified to do the work that they're doing. With workforce planning, there's been a lot of talk about this, like I said before, especially given all of the changes that are happening in the workforce and all the many generations that we have. So one of the things that I think is very important to understand is that when you do this forecasting, you've got to make sure that you're doing it very deliberately. You have different forecasting definitions, so to speak. The demand pool, which really is, it's based on specific position openings that are likely to occur. So it's not based on internal supply only, it's really based on what is likely to come up, and then how do you forecast for that. So this could be, you know that there's a nursing shortage, and so what you're doing is you're doing a lot of new grad recruitment based on the positions that are likely to occur. Or you know that you're building I'll just talk about us. We just opened a brand new ED, and we knew that we were going to need to be hiring in certain folks to be able to staff that ED, because it's a lot larger than our current ED. So as a result, you put planning and forecasting in place based on what's likely to occur in the future. You do some guesstimating, so to speak, but it's based on a lot of very real data and numbers. Supply and push is really based on internal supply that moves through promotions, lateral moves or terminations. So it's really you thinking through what's coming up. You have a bunch of people that are retiring, or you have a bunch of people that are moving into their next role of their career. So there's a supply issue, but you're pushing based on the fact that they're going to be moving into other roles. And so you want to be sure that you forecast what types of roles you're going to need. We know for some of our entry-level positions that they're going to be going into other positions in the organization. So it's our responsibility to ensure that we are looking at that supply to make sure to backfill those positions, because we know that's going to happen. You have probability models, and this is really forecasting internal flow from one job category to the next. That is, usually it's called a transition matrix. So it's really kind of looking at what that flow looks like. You have to do retrospective analysis, because there are going to be ways you can look based on what happened last year, what happened over the past 3 years, to be able to get those probability models in place so that you can forecast going forward. Strategic workforce planning is really analyzing the current situation, forecasting demand, and aligning the budget and forecasts supply, which is going to be your internal and your labor market. So it's really looking at, okay, so here's our current situation, here's what we think is going to happen, and then we need to align it with the budget and then forecast what the supply looks like with our internal resources, and then what does that look like that we need to go out to the external labor market. So that would be kind of the act or the process of strategic workforce planning. Succession analysis really is identifying the potential pipeline into leadership. This can be identifying the positions, but then identifying the training and experiential learning that needs to happen. You need to ensure that you have bench strength underneath those leadership positions, and there might be a specific target. You may think, I mean, for instance, I've seen a lot of organizations want to promote 80% from within the organization, only externally recruiting 20%. That may be their goal. And then they work towards that every year. I know for us, you know, we have goals that we're trying to meet, and we look at that every year to see how are we doing on internal promotion as a piece of our total leadership hire that year. So succession analysis really does go hand in hand with succession planning, because you have to kind of look at what's going on in your organization and where your gaps are so that you can have a good succession plan moving forward. And every organization has some new way of going about succession planning. There are 9 boxes, 4 boxes, ranking. There's all kinds of different ways that people do succession planning. There's not a right or wrong way. It just depends on what your organization is going to use, and then what are those outcomes that need to come out of that analysis so that you can then have tactics that you're putting in place to actually achieve the goals that you're looking for. Just doing the analysis isn't going to help if it doesn't have any actions that back it up. Okay, so first question. A health services organization should use which of the following sequential processes to establish HR objectives and policies? Analyze the current HR situation, forecast HR demand, reconcile with the budget, forecast HR supply. Design HR recruitment and selection activities, develop and have an HR compensation plan and establish HR appraisal system, determine HR job structure, perform evaluations, establish training and development, or conduct an HR job analysis, determine best HR job structure, and establish policies. So I'm going to give everybody a chance to, if you have, let me figure out the best way to do this here. If anyone wants to raise their hand, I'm going to see if I can actually see you. If anybody wants to take a stab at their thought. Anyone? Don't be shy.
Justin.
Ah, thank you. Okay, Justin, can you unmute yourself and give us your answer?
Just a guess, but maybe the first option?
Correct. You're exactly right. Thank you so much, Justin. Being a brave soul. Exactly. You really have to analyze your current HR situation first. You've got to figure out where you are so that you understand where the gaps are, what the needs are going to be, what's that demand, and then reconciling with the budget, and then forecasting the supply. So great job. Okay, so next question. I think I'm going to be able to do this. There we go. So I have another question. Who would like to take this one? I'll read the question just in case anybody can't see it. Forecasting organizational need for human resources by focusing on specific position openings that are likely to occur and using these for planning is called? This one may be a little trickier. We went over it, but this is a few slides back.
One person said demand pull.
Correct. That's exactly right. Good job. Yeah, so it's demand pull because you're looking at what's likely to occur and using that as your reference based on what the demand's going to be. All right, good. Okay, motivational theories. There's content versus process, basically. And the first one is Maslow's hierarchy, and you guys probably are familiar with that, but that's really a hierarchy of needs. And it's not a constant state, but we're motivated by different items. And once the basics are satisfied, you're going to move to the higher levels of needs achievement. And so I'll give you an example of that. For instance, I think we actually might have a slide. Yeah, I'll just hold on Maslow. We'll go over it in the next slide. Herzberg is really talking about hygiene versus motivators. So factors that are influencing your motivation. Okay, so hygiene are factors that must be present, like salary, facility to work, etc. And motivators may be tangible or intangible, like increase to pay versus recognition or feedback on job well done. So Herzberg is really talking about there's certain things that motivate you that are just fundamental to life, and then there are others that are more internal and intangible that are part of motivation. McClelland really talks about achievement, power, and affiliation, and it's really just what are the motivating goals of individuals. Is it that they want to achieve, they want power, they want affiliation with certain kind of groups? You know, those are the different ways that people are motivated, and we have lots of examples of that we can think of in our own lives or in people that we work with, where how you're motivated is a really important part for your manager to be in touch with, because somebody could motivate me by telling me how great I am, but if that's not what motivates me, if what motivates me is achievement of something, or if what motivates me is that next promotion or more money or something like that, then they could be trying to motivate me the whole wrong way. And so that's not going to be very beneficial in the end. And then you have process, which is really talking about what are the processes and how do those impact motivation. So equity is really talking about what's fair, okay, wanting things to be fair. And that's definitely a very big thing that we hear about a lot in social media. We hear a lot about it in the news, is making sure that the processes are fair. You know, you talk about equal pay, or you talk about ensuring that you're not being treated differently than somebody else based on all of the different areas under Title VII. And we can talk a little bit more about that later, but so equity being one. Expectancy, I know what is expected, I get what I give. Okay, so having that expectancy process in place so that people know if I do X, Y, Z, I'm going to get D at the end. And then there's reinforcement, which is good performance is reinforced and valued. Reinforcement goes positive or negative depending on how people respond to different things that someone does. So if I do something and it's met with negative reinforcement, then or a negative outcome, I'll be negatively reinforced to do that in the future. Whereas positive reinforcement will encourage that behavior in days to come. And then there's goal setting, which is really a goal being established both from the leader and the employee, so that there's a mutually established expectation and then goal set to be able to motivate that employee to good performance or whatever's on the table to be discussed. That's set and measured, so it's not just a pie in the sky goal. It's something that can be measurable, just kind of like the SMART goals idea. But goals are set and measured, and then again, they're decided on mutually from both parties. Okay, so this is a little bit, I know that this is a question, but I'm going to work this slide a little bit more as just educational. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs really starts as sort of a pyramid, if you'll think, with respect to the bottom being those needs that are essential to life. So for instance, that would be things like food and water, things like physiological needs. All of those would be the bottom of the pyramid. Those are the things that are essential, must have, or cannot survive in the world. So once those needs are met, then you move up one to safety. Okay, so safety is things like money, okay? It's things like medical care. Those are things that would be under that safety umbrella. And so once you've got the basics, then you've got safety, and then you move into belonging. And belonging would be things like family and friends and, you know, really having that community, things like that. That's that third layer. So then once you've met all three of those layers, then you move into the esteem bucket. And the esteem bucket really is getting you closer and closer to self-actualization. But Maslow's idea was that you got to meet all those other criteria before you're ever going to get to esteem or self-actualization. And self-actualization is at the top. So I hope that that kind of helps to break down what some of those would be. The only one I think we didn't talk about here is education. And education is going to be based in the safety bucket. So that's how that would work. So just to clarify again, it goes physiological, food and water, then it goes, which would be basic, then it would go into safety, which is your medical care, money, education, then you move into belonging, which is your family and your friends, then you're going to move to esteem, and then you're going to move to self-actualization. All right. Okay, so motivational problems. Inadequate performance definitions. So I don't know if you've gone through, I'm assuming you have, performance evaluations and things like that. So when you have inadequate performance definitions, it's unclear what performance is supposed to look like. So if you're an executive and somebody says you meet expectations, okay? Now to you, you may be like, I don't want to meet expectations, I want to exceed expectations, or I want to be exemplary. But meeting the expectations as an executive is pretty spectacular because the expectations are very high. So it's making sure that performance definitions are clear. Like, what does the definition of high performance mean? What does the definition of meeting expectations mean? So sometimes that can be very demotivating to people because what they feel like is that they're not able to achieve because they don't understand what they're being defined as. And so I think that's one of the big problems with motivation if it's not clearly defined. A lot of times there can be impediments or obstacles to performance. So it could be that you have a very high performing employee, but there's some obstacle that is preventing them from being able to be as effective as they need to be or to do their job well. So one example would be that you have a very high performing employee, but there are too many things they're trying to get done at one time. So it's not clear what the priority areas are or where they should be focusing. So that can be an impediment to keeping them motivated because they're spread too thin. They don't have an ability to get everything done and to be successful at the same time. And then inadequate performance reward linkages. There's a lot of information, and you guys are all in executive roles, so you know that if you don't tie performance to reward, you're going to be able, it's not going to help people understand why that metric is so important. And so that's why a lot of times you have incentive plans which basically ensure that if the organization performs at XYZ on these different metrics, there's a reward attached, there's a bonus, or there's a increase in salary, or there is something, or there is, I mean, I've known people that have tried to think outside of the box, and so they offer people, you can work from home 1 day a week. I know these days in COVID, that doesn't necessarily sound all that great, but back before COVID, where people had to work at home, having a reward attached to a higher performance evaluation or things like that is a big motivator for people. But if you don't have those performance reward linkages, you can have motivational problems with the employees. So motivation solutions, improving performance definitions, making sure that job descriptions are accurate, that what you need in the role is accurate, that there aren't additional things that people are doing that are not covered in their job description, that that you have very clear expectations so that somebody doesn't get into the job thinking they have the ability to do this, they have the experience, and then they get in there and it's a totally different thing than they thought. So I think that it's very important that job descriptions are very tight and that they make a lot of sense based on what the role is. Sometimes, you know, we have to change job descriptions because we realize, oh, well, we didn't need this part. This part of the job is not actually being done, and it's being done by somebody else. Or we need to add in additional duties to this role and reprice it and relook at who we have, what criteria they need to have, what background, things like that. So job descriptions change often, but I think that's one thing that's very important to keep motivation high. Also, standards. You know, standards are going to be important whenever you're looking at performance, because the standards may change. You know, you have a new system, or you have a new way of doing something, and the standards might change in the way that that's being done currently. And so making sure that you adjust for that. And then feedback. It could be that you have people that are at the front line doing a certain job, but it's not efficient, or it doesn't make sense operationally the way you thought it was, the way you anticipated. So getting that feedback from people at the front lines, this is a lot of performance improvement work, lean work, things that you see in that kind of space, where people at the front lines have ideas on ways that they can be done differently, and therefore it may change everything about the way that it's been done in the past. So getting that feedback. I think one thing as leaders that's so important is to be able to eliminate obstacles, to be able to look at what are those obstacles that are helping to derail different processes or different people in their roles, improving the selection of the people that are going into the job. It might be that what used to work in this certain type of employee is going to change. You know, before they didn't need to have technical ability in one certain way, or they didn't need to have savvy with Excel or savvy with a computer system, but now they do. And so it's going to change the selection criteria with which you use. And then there's job redesign, job enrichment, and then enhancing the compensation and benefits. You know, those are really important aspects of motivation for our team. Motivation Solutions continues here with strengthening performance reward linkage, like we mentioned, behavior modification, coaching, being able to help people know what right looks like, and giving them the tools and the snapshot of what it is that you're looking for out of them if they're not meeting the criteria. Pay for performance is a really important piece because it ties pay to how they do each year. Most organizations have moved to merit-based pay for performance evaluations or end of year instead of cost of living increase, really because they see that, you know, they can really differentiate those people who are high performers from people that maybe aren't, because they give them merit increases based on how they performed that year prior. Autonomy, you know, I think that's been the thing that I've seen recently more than anything with all of the COVID work, is that people are given a lot more autonomy, a lot more working from home, a lot more control over how they complete the work. That's very motivating to people, especially when you have different generations that expect that and go into the workforce wanting autonomy, wanting freedom. As long as the work gets done, they want to be able to do it their way, so to speak. And to some degree, in some roles, that works out very well. But autonomy is a really important aspect of motivation. Work teams, being able to be a part of work teams, being able to know what that dynamic looks like, that experience. Some of the best work I've ever had a chance to work on has been on work teams, and been able to work as a team to accomplish a large goal that one person could certainly not do on their own. Like I said, we just opened a brand new ED, and that was a huge work of a lot of different teams coming together to accomplish a gigantic goal. Other financial and non-financial rewards, things like recognitions, joining professional organizations. You know, a lot of organizations do support things like what's happening right now with you going after your FACHE and you being a part of GAHI and ACHE, being able to be recognized by leaders, be recognized with, some people really like tchotchkes with their company's, you know, logo emblazoned on it. I totally do. I'm completely a tchotchke kind of girl. So I love when there's recognition that comes in the form of Wellstar garb or something like that. So that may be a way to motivate your teams. Okay, so before I go here, I want to take a second and see if there's anybody that has questions. I know I've been kind of a one big run-on sentence, so I want to be sure that if you have questions that I can try to help before we move forward. No pressure if you don't. Okay, well, it doesn't look like anybody does, so we'll keep going. So conflict. A lot of people don't like conflict. I have to say that's a part of my day-to-day job. Whether I like it or not is just a necessary part of being in HR. So is conflict healthy or is it unhealthy? There are a lot of different opinions about that. And so I'm not going to weigh in one way or the other. I will say that when you don't ever have conflict and you have two very strong opinionated people, some people, unless one of them is just really good at sort of taking the back seat on things, maybe that might be the case, but in most relationships, work relationships or other, you're going to have conflict to some degree at some point because we're all different. We all have different perspectives. So what are some of the causes of conflict? And sometimes it can be based on what we have to do. It could be some of the causes can ask us these questions, which is what do we do when we have conflict? Who is involved in that conflict? And then how do we go about the process of resolving it? Okay, so managing conflict. So there are four different types of managing, or four different ways you can manage conflict. The first one is to accommodate. So if you're accommodating somebody during a conflict, it's really just that you adjust yourself. Okay, that you're like, you know what, I don't want to deal with this conflict, so I'm just going to adjust the way I am, keep the peace, all is good. And so that can be one way of managing conflict. The other one could be pressing, okay? So pressing is when you push for the desired outcome that you want. So instead of sort of that accommodating spirit where you're just like, I'm going to keep the peace, be a duck, water roll off my back, you press on. You press on to whatever your goal is. Avoidance would be when you just ignore it. You know what, there's conflict, I'm out of here. I don't need this, I'm busy, blah, blah. So you just ignore the conflict brewing. And then negotiating is really a mutual dialogue, and it's when you get to yes. Okay, so it's when both parties negotiate kind of where they're at, and your goal is to get to yes, where you guys are aligned. Okay, so that would be the negotiation style of managing conflict. So there's some different strategies around negotiation. There's distributive, which is claiming value. And this is where it's important because you're both coming into it really to divide the pie of the negotiation, sort of how much is going to be obtained, where do we divide the pie, and it's really a necessary part of getting through that negotiation process because you're distributing the responsibility, so to speak. Integrative, which is about creating value, is not required, and it's where you find mutually beneficial solutions. Okay, so differences and preferences are going to allow this to occur, but the value is created because both people are coming out in the end in a better place. Okay, so that would be another aspect of negotiation. So you might have heard of BATNA, which is Best Alternative to Negotiated Agreement. So that's really talking about, okay, what's the best alternative? How do we get there? We have an agreement at the end, but you're looking for what is that the best option available for all. You've got your reservation price or bottom line. You might have heard of this in other contexts, which is really the limit on a price of a good or a service. So what is that good or service worth? And what is that limit with which we're willing to negotiate to get to that? And then you've got your aspiration level, which is what we would like to get, what we would like our expected outcome to be, and what is our intended objective in that negotiation. And really the aspirational level is sort of that mentality of you get more if you ask for more. So it's really just that aspirational level of what you want, and in the end you will get a better outcome because you've asked for more than what you actually expect. So that's some information around negotiation. All right, so now I'm going to shift gears over to managing intergroup conflict, okay? So we're going to talk about 4 different intergroup conflict processes or ways of going about it. The first one is avoidance, and this is really just evading the conflict. You know, kind of like what we talked about before. It's where you ignore it, you evade it, you don't want to get in the middle of it. A lot of people who hate conflict go this route because they just would rather not deal with somebody who's kind of going, trying to continue to fight the fight. They just want to avoid it altogether, so they evade it. Diffusion really is dealing, it's really where you're trying to diffuse the situation, you're trying to deal with it directly, but you're also trying to de-escalate. Okay, you're trying to diffuse the conflict, make it, kind of ease it out. A lot of times in diffusion, while you're diffusing the argument, sometimes both parties don't always get to the bottom line of what they need, though. So it can be a little difficult at times with diffusing. Containment really is checking the it's basically where you're trying to take the hostile power away from it getting bigger and growing greater. So you're really trying to create those strategic alliances so that you have support on your side, but at the same time, you're trying to not have it get bigger and bigger, the conflict blow up and blow up. And so a lot of times when people are containing it, they're not actually dealing with it. They're just keeping everything kind of on the surface, containing the conflict the best they can by having other people kind of in their corner, but not ever really dealing with the conflict. And then you have confrontation, which is really where one party confronts the other, and they do it directly, and they are doing it really to basically have conflict get better, but they have to confront it first. So it's between the two parties or between multiple parties where they're confronting the other person in an effort to deal with the conflict, get it done, but sometimes it can be very adversarial because it can be very combative at times based on how they go about it. But that is what the confrontation process would look like. Any questions around conflict? I think that's my last conflict one, so I want to be sure. Anybody? Just don't want to miss looking if you guys have your hands up. Okay. So the next topic we're going to look at is around, okay, that's not the next, hold on. Okay, well, I'm missing a slide, so we'll, oh, okay. Anyway, managing intergroup conflict. So just kidding, we actually, we did that. Okay, so performance appraisal. So performance appraisal really has 4 different ways that people go about the performance appraisal process. You have category ratings, which are really the most common way to go about performance evaluations, and those are on scales of 1 to 5. Could be that you have 1 being poor performance and then 5 being exemplary, and then you have a bunch of different ones in between. So those are category ratings. Comparative methods really are more ranking, where you're comparing employee to employee. It's very time consuming because you want to be able to have really good objective criteria with which you're doing that. Some people do forced ranking, which is even harder, where you have to put people in an 80, 10 and 10, 10 poor, 80 middle of the road, 10 high performers. So there's a lot of methods out there about comparative methods, but that would be one way of doing performance appraisals. You have narrative methods, which are behavior description, critical incident narrative, where you're describing decision-making, thinking, application of knowledge or skill. A lot of times you might have competencies, or they're typically done as competencies, where you have organizational competencies, or you have job description related competencies, leadership competencies, and those are really how you're measuring the performance of others. So that would be considered a narrative-based method. But like I said, it's just like with comparative, it's very, very time-consuming. But it's also from my experience and the organizations that I've worked for, narrative methods are great because it gives the best feedback to the employee. And it gives the employee feedback that is going to help them to perform better or to understand the deficiencies. And so narrative-based, that can work in combination with category ratings, because you're giving a 1 to 5 based on that narrative. Sometimes it's much more in a paragraph form where you're actually giving them very specific examples. Then you have special, which is really talking about BARS, which is the behaviorally anchored rating scale, which that is it's a scale based on components of job behaviors that are defined. So you, as you're creating your job descriptions and your different job positions, you're going to have behaviors that you connect to that. And then you rate people based on how they are doing on those behaviors, whatever those behaviors look like. This is also really important in succession planning because there need to be specific behaviors that are important, and leadership behaviors, you know, important for you as an organization to be able to hold people to expectations and behaviors, but you've got to identify what those are first. What are the most important 4 to 5 behaviors that you want your leaders to exhibit throughout the year, and then you can rate them based on that. It's a scientific method, so to speak, but it's also very defensible in court. So if you have somebody who is saying that they're not being rated appropriately, but you have specific behaviors that they are or are not doing, then it's very objective and you can treat every employee along those same lines. And it's a very defensible way to explain that should you ever be in a court environment where you're being said that you're treating people differently. And these are behaviors that are established scientifically through that job analysis process. So that's why that job analysis, like I said before, is very much the cornerstone of HR. These are some of those things that need to be established as you're coming up with those jobs and what they're supposed to look like. All right, this was the one that I got out of order here. Okay, productivity and staffing methods. So productivity is the ratio of outputs to inputs. Total patient days over RN FTEs, collections over FTEs. Just in case anybody doesn't work in the world of FTEs, that's full-time equivalent is what that means, but I'm pretty sure that all of us, since we're in healthcare environments, probably do. The number of X over the worked or paid hours. And then one of the biggest ones, which is FTE over adjusted average daily census. That's probably the one most people are familiar with. Efficiency is really the cost per unit of service. Okay, so that's what efficiency, how it would be defined from an HR perspective. You have staffing methods. We've talked a little bit about this. Really, you guys are mostly operators, is what I would guess. And you know, so this is going to be very, you know, old school for you. But basically, acuity based, which is going to be based on what the acuity of the patient load looks like. So if you have a high acuity unit, like right now, we have lots of patients that have high acuity in a lot of our organizations, you might staff differently. Like there may be a different ratio of staff to patient that you use in an acuity-based model that is going to be very different than what a traditional nurse to patient ratio might look like. You also have flexible departments where it's all based on volume. And so you're going to have a different volume or a different FTE equivalent based on sort of what the volume looks like. Your FTEs are going to adjust as well. So you might flex off, or you might ramp up and have overtime or different things like that based on just what your volume looks like. And then you have your fixed units, which would be like an HR would be a fixed unit, which would be something that doesn't change based on volume. It is what it is, and that's what it is, and that's how you budget. So your budgeting is very fixed in that kind of a scenario. All right, so I have a question. So who would like to take this? The question is, which of the following statements best defines increased productivity? And I won't read this one to you guys. You can read it. Raise your hand if you'd like to answer it.
Jenna, someone said third option.
Yes, third option. Good job. The third option is an increase in productivity occurs when a reduction occurs in the ratio of hours worked to the number of units of service rendered. Good job. All right. So let's see. Okay, so productivity efficiency factors. So really ensuring that you have high standards and goals so that everyone knows really what the standards of productivity are, that they understand what that, how that interacts with efficiency, and that the goals are set and communicated. Information and feedback, understanding what are those mitigating reasons why productivity may or may not be meeting the same goal that has been established in the first place. There may be that you need to, it could be the productivity, you could have a, I'm sorry, I just lost exactly what I was going to say, but you could have your metric that you're being based on for your productivity could be inaccurate. It could be that what you're supposed to be, like it could be your unit of service is off. And so there could be reasons that things don't look right. And so it's really getting that information, that feedback from the frontline manager to ensure that your productivity is accurately displayed, especially if things aren't looking like they should or they have. Interdepartmental coordination and resource sharing. A lot of times you might have a lot of issues, for instance, you know, with all of the different changing dynamics in our workforce today, a lot of interdepartment coordination has to go on because you might have one department that doesn't have near the staffing challenges that another does, and then how do you share those resources? How do you ensure that everyone can still stay productive, but you make sure that you're allocating the resources where they're needed and not, it is a little bit of robbing Peter to pay Paul, but in essence, you're making sure that you're evaluating those things and really having that coordination strong. Aligning to compensation systems, making sure that the way that you're looking at your staffing and your efficiency aligns with the compensation systems that you have in place as an organization. Because that may be that you have to think differently around compensation or philosophy or those kinds of things as there are changes that happen in your organization. Physician involvement in decision-making and governance. We see that as an incredibly important part because the physicians are a very integral part of every one of our departments, pretty much. And they have to be involved in decision-making and governance because they have very strong opinions and we have to work in tandem. So it's making sure that some of the decisions that we make for the unit may have implications. And if we don't get in front of that from the physician involvement, that can be very difficult later down the line. Legal and regulatory factors. And so I'm going to stay a little high level on this because there's a lot of detail I could get into with it, but I'm going to give you the basics of what these are talking about. So Fair Labor Standards Act really is talking about compensation, is talking about positions that are exempt or non-exempt, meaning that they get overtime or they don't. Really talking about how you pay people and making sure that that everything is being done correctly and fairly, and ensuring that you don't have, because you could have where you're not paying people overtime. Okay, you could have a situation where there are pay practices in place that aren't legal. And so the Fair Labor Standards Act regulates that. So a lot of the compensation work that is done really to meet the criteria of this legislation. Non-discrimination legislation, which is a lot of what I deal with in my role and a lot of what most HR people do. You have different legislation, and again, this is really high level. Equal Pay Act is just what it says. There's been a lot of press about this over the past couple of years where people being paid equally, regardless of gender, regardless of any kind of criteria, that the job should be worth the job based on the same experience, and there should be no disparity. Okay, and that's been a big piece of in the media in particular. The Civil Rights Act. So this is really talking about making sure that everyone is treated equally, that people have the same rights, that their rights aren't being violated. We have a question in the book, which we're going to look at in a minute. Civil Rights Act also is the very first place where privacy is discussed, which is interesting. You wouldn't necessarily think that, but there'll be a question on which is the very first law that talked about right to privacy, and the Civil Rights Act is that act. Age discrimination in employment really is talking about how you have a lot of people that will say, well, I was discriminated based on my age, and that's why I didn't get the job, or that's why I didn't get the promotion, or that's why you're giving me performance management feedback. And so there's a law that specifically speaks to you can't discriminate against somebody, and usually that cutoff is 40. So you might hear about it's called ADIA, which is Age Discrimination in Employment Act. Then there's the ADA, very, very big with the world of HR because there's so many intricacies to it. Pretty much there are very few illnesses or criteria with which the ADA does not cover. Okay, so that's changed in the past few years. But the Americans with Disabilities Act is ensuring that people are not discriminated against based on any disability or perceived disability. This pertains to a ton of different items. And so this is one that is also tricky because people can ask for an accommodation, and a lot of organizations, especially big ones, you saying you can't give an accommodation may or may not be accurate, because if you're a large organization and you have a large bottom line, there's a bigger expectation as to what you can afford to do, what's reasonable, so that somebody would have the ability to do their job even with a disability. So American Disabilities Act is a really important act to remember. And then you have the FMLA. So FMLA, many of you may have actually participated in being on FMLA in the past, but it's basically Family Medical Leave Act. It talks about once you've met certain criteria for how long you've been employed, I think it's 12 months and 1,250 hours, you do qualify for this federal time away from work. It's usually 12 weeks. Some organizations have it to be longer, but it's not pay. Okay, so it's leave away from work. It's protected, meaning if me, decided to have a baby, then I would be protected. My job would stay protected for 12 weeks. Now, or my job, or as long as they brought me back into a similar job with similar pay or with same pay and all that kind of stuff, then, they can do that. But after the 12 weeks, then I'm no longer covered for my job. Now, during that 12 weeks, unless I have additional money or funding or processes or something like that, it's not giving me pay for 12 weeks. It's just allowing me to be off. But this is a really important act because it does protect the person's job during that 12 weeks. And this can be for a family medical issue, or it could be for your own medical issue. It could also be for the adoption of a child. So there are a lot of more criteria to it, but this is the only specific act that talks about pay when not working. Okay, so it's a very important act to remember, and it's got a lot of tentacles to it when people when they don't abide by it. So there's a lot of legal implications. Okay, so I gave you this answer a minute ago, but which was the first major law to have significant impact on individual privacy in the workplace? You'd like to take that one. Anyone?
Civil rights.
Good job. Civil Rights Act. All right. So, get out of this. Okay. All right. So, sexual harassment. So, sexual harassment is there are two different areas with which kind of fall up under the bigger umbrella. Quid pro quo, which means this for that, is what it actually means in the Latin version of that. And it's really talking about, I'll do this for you if you do that for me. And it's typically talking about advancement, hiring, more money, things that a manager or boss or somebody with power would give to a subordinate, coworker, something for sexual favors, relationship, things along those lines. So it's just quid pro quo. I'll do this
Jenna?
for you. Yes.
I have a question, if it's okay to interrupt. I have a question from
Sure.
Steve Cargus. In terms of employee productivity, is there an accepted formula to involve not only the hours worked, the number of units of service, but also the complexity and difficulty of performing one's responsibilities?
There are lots of different acuity models out there, and so the best thing they can do is look to their nursing, the nursing organizations that can give them based on what type of, and I'm only saying nursing, it could be anything, but whatever the regulatory body of that would be. So if it was AORN for an OR nurse, to be able to look at what the acuity and what the typical ratio would be and something like that, That's much more operational than HR. So I would encourage them to go look from that perspective. Great question. But yes, I think that is the idea behind acuity-based, is what is going to be entailed in that person doing their job, and how do we ensure that they have the right staff and staffing model to be able to accomplish that job, given the fact that there's intricacies to that. Like, you know, if you have an ECMO program, it's going to look different than if you're in a med-surg floor. All right. So quid pro quo. So, so you have a lot of situations where this might happen. It's typically unwanted advances. You might have, I'll just give an outlandish example. You might have a CEO who has a executive assistant, and he invites the executive assistant out to drinks and a relationship, and she says no, and so he gives her a bad mid-year, and she has a totally different type of work. That would be sexual harassment. You know, now she could say yes, and then she's promoted next week, and that would also be sexual harassment. So it's whenever there's a this for that. So it's really the onus on the manager to be very cognizant of what sexual harassment looks like and what can be perceived as sexual harassment. And this can be same-sex sexual harassment. This can be different genders. But it's very important. It's very important to know. We see that was something that hasn't been as much communicated until recent years about same-sex sexual harassment, but it is absolutely there. Hostile work environment is a little broader. This can include things like sending sexual jokes in email. This can be, you know, catcalling. It's all workplace related, but it can be where you're creating a hostile work environment for that employee. You may not say, I'll give you this for that, because there may not be the power struggle, but you could have a coworker who you're in a hostile work environment because they are treating you sort of in a sexually hostile environment. This can also be a hostile work environment where there's anger, or there's cursing, or there's racial slangs, or there's all kinds of things that can be a part of the hostile work environment piece that has nothing to do with sexual, but a lot of times we see it from a sexual harassment perspective, where people have a lot of times you'll see, or people will be in the break room and they'll tell lewd jokes, and it'll be very offensive to somebody who's not even in the conversation but overhears it. And so that's still not appropriate. You know, that's still, it can still be harassing in nature. So there's a lot of ways that this has to be managed, and sexual harassment training is very important for organizations to have that on a regular cadence. Because if you do have a sexual harassment policy and you do have training that the organization does, even if you have a situation where somebody oversteps or goes around that, you have a much better ability as an employer to deal with that than if you don't have anything in place, because then you haven't been proactive at all to be able to avoid that. And I think with everything going on the past couple of years, where all of the different things have come out in the media and things that have come out in lots of organizations, this is a hot topic. And this is something that has gone very under the radar for an incredibly long time. So, so it's very important to have that. I could go on for a long time about this because it is a big piece that HR people see. But I can answer any questions if you have some later. Okay, so labor relations. You may not have any unions in your environment. We don't where I work as well, but I have worked in union environments. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what labor relations looks like. Whenever you're going into the bargaining process where you're coming up with your collective bargaining agreement, your CBA, you have to go in with good faith bargaining, but you're going in knowing that there's going to be a little give and take, that it's not going to be all in favor of one or the other, that you go into every bargaining session where there is that good faith bargaining on both sides. Arbitration is really how you do conflict resolution in a union environment. That's usually written into the collective bargaining agreement, that this is how we're going to go about any conflict that we can't get resolved. I've been in environments where we had a person who was making very threatening workplace violence scenario type statements, and we had to go through arbitration. We couldn't really deal with it with the employee because there was a union. And so we had to go through an arbitration process. So it prolonged the conclusion and the resolution on that. So that does happen, but that is also very common as far as arbitration is. There is a formal grievance process that's spelled out in the collective bargaining agreement, but that is part of how you handle any situation that comes up. You have a shop steward, typically, who's the person who works with the organization. That is, the shop steward is actually a part of the union, but they work with the leaders and with HR to handle any of the grievance processes that come up. And there also is a role with relationships to informal leaders. So there are a lot of people. So just let me back up. With unions, anyone that is in a supervisory position or above is not able to be a part of the union. So you will have informal leaders, which are, and we've all seen them, they're people who have taken leadership, whether or not they have that title. So they can be very beneficial to organizations depending on the situation, or they can also be very detrimental. And so it's really important with those informal leaders to have good, strong relationships with them, to not underestimate what their role is in the relationship with their employees, and to be able to also know who those are. Who are those people that are informal leaders, and how do you have people that are informal leaders who either are not a part of the union that can also help employees understand the benefits to not being in the union? Because I think a lot of times employees, they look at it like the union's going to do all the stuff for them, and they don't realize that the unions don't always deliver on the things that they say they're going to do. And then they also are, so then the employees can be stuck paying dues every month in an organization, to an organization that maybe isn't fulfilling the things that they thought they would do. So it's a tricky rope, and there's a lot of important things to do and not to do with unions and how you communicate to your employees. So, and we can talk more about that offline. I don't think you necessarily need it for the purposes of this exam, but it is very important to be very clear on how to interact with unions.